Hello, church friends. I'm Edie Wiarda, and I am continuing the Chelsea First United Methodist Church experiment and explorations in virtual church. I am the person who is perhaps most responsible for developing the Lenten materials that we're working through together during this Lenten season. And of course, we've experienced a lot of disruption. The small groups can no longer meet in person. So Pastor Rodney approached me and said, maybe we can find a creative way to continue our exploration of some of these materials and thoughts. And so we're going to give it a shot. The small groups were meeting on different days of the week, and so they weren't all at the same spot in the Lenten study on any given day. And so I was a little unsure where I wanted to pick this up. I'm going to start with the lesson for week 3, partly because I think some of you would have gone through this already, but some groups were disrupted before they had a chance to get to this. And also, when I looked at the topic for week 3, it was just obvious that this is something that's important that we explore together. The topic for this week, or this week's study, was entitled Contemplations on Grief, Disaster, and Loss. And it's about the church's role in times of death. And of course, when I pulled this together, I was thinking about the church administering to particular families as they experience grief. And now there's a little different perspective on that. I find myself thinking about the news stories out of Italy, which is a little further along on the coronavirus curve than the United States. But there have been stories about the sorrow of families who have lost someone, and they can't pull together in community to grieve. They can't hold funerals. And that's tough. So that's something I think we need to be thinking about as we go through these materials. The study this week starts with a lament. Often the laments are taken from the book of Psalms, but this one comes from the book of Job. A messenger came to Job and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone escaped to tell you." Job replied, "My sighing comes like my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. Truly the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me, when the Almighty was still with me, when my children were around me. But now my inward parts are in turmoil and are never still. Days of affliction come to meet me. My lyre is turned to mourning, and my pipe to the voice of those who weep." What strikes me about Job's lament is its expression of something that's really common among people who grieve, especially if they've suffered a sudden loss, and that sense that they wish they could claw back time and turn the clock back and change what happened and get back into that time when things were good. But of course, God gives us consolation. And I love this passage from Revelation. Chapter 21, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." This is God's promise to us, and it is important in these times that we prepare ourselves to convey confidence in God's promises of a new heaven and a new earth where all our loved ones are with us. One of the writers that I have really come to appreciate is a guy by the name of Thomas Lynch, who is not only a writer and a poet, but he spent most of his adult life in the career of being an undertaker, a funeral director in the town of Milford, Michigan. If you haven't had a chance to enjoy his writing, I really recommend the book called The Undertaking. And he talks a lot about his experience of being a funeral director in a relatively small town and the relationships that he develops with people in that role, and just his perspective from being one of the only folks in town who can't pretend that death doesn't happen. So one of the readings is drawn from that book, The Undertaking. This is what he has to say. Better than baptisms or marriages, funerals press the noses of the faithful against the windows of their faith. Vision and insight are often coincidental with demise. Death is the moment when the chips are down, that moment of truth when the truth that we die makes relevant the claims of our prophets and apostles. Faith is not required to sing in the choir, for bake sales or building drives, to usher or deacon or elder or priest. Faith is for the time of our dying and the time of the dying of the ones we love. That's a pretty profound statement about how important funerals are in the life of the church. And it absolutely is the case. You know, I can think of times when, think of stories that I've heard where it wasn't until they were confronted with a really difficult life situation and a death in the family that people really came to terms with why they were in church. Each of these weekly Lenten studies includes some questions in a section that's called Reflection. And this is an area where I wish we were together in a room, because I'll read through some of these questions for you to think about, and I'll offer just a few of my experiences that I would be offering if we were in a group together. And I wish that I were hearing your experiences in exchange. The reflections section starts like this. The death of a loved one is a deeply unsettling event. Through funeral ministries, churches place themselves in the middle of profound pain and grief. First question is, in your own family's times of bereavement, what were sources of comfort? Were there particular aspects of a church's funeral ministry that conveyed God's grace? I've thought about that with regard to funeral services that I remember. I've certainly been to many where the service clearly was a source of solace and comfort for the family and for the community. I've also been to some funeral services where they were not a source of comfort and, in fact, increased a family's pain. I remember going to, and I don't want to overstate this story, but I remember going to the funeral service of my husband's grandfather. This was shortly after he and I were married. And Bob's grandpa was a lovely Polish guy from Chicago. And his family, his grandchildren adored him. And I had never gotten to know Bob's grandmother. She had suffered from Alzheimer's for many years, and Bob's grandfather had insisted that she never go to a home. He had cared for her himself for, as I recall, something like 8 or 10 years. It had been a long time. And I remember sitting in that funeral and hearing the message, and I just remember feeling like it sounded like they were describing the wrong guy. It talked about sort of a gruff man, and maybe you didn't really know if he loved you or not. And I thought, boy, that just doesn't sound right. But mostly I remember coming out of the service and talking with Bob's mother, my mother-in-law, right afterwards, and she said, I wish someone had mentioned how Daddy took care of Mother all those years. And I thought, wow, that's a tough thing to live with when you feel like your loved one was not, that he was not described in a way that did him justice. I also want to share that one of the main reasons why I ended up in this congregation was because of the funeral ministry, the funeral meal ministry. My dad had passed away. He lived at CRC with my mom, and Bob and I were attending church at Waterloo United Methodist at the time. We were new to church. And when my dad died, I was confronted with where are we going to have a funeral meal? Because I knew a lot of people were going to be coming. And our church out at Waterloo didn't have its social hall at that time, and it was just, there was no place to do it. And CRC had no place that was big enough. And so I was starting to look into restaurants and banquet halls around the area. And my friend Kathy Carter said to me, you really should talk to folks at my church at First Methodist here in town, because we do this. We'll put on a funeral lunch for someone who's not a member. And at first I was a little bit reticent about that. I thought, gosh, that's just asking too much. And then I thought, no, you know what? This is what churches do. And it was lovely. And I continue to be grateful for that. The second question is, have you seen cases where a church provided bereavement help to families with no connection to that congregation? How did this happen, and what difference did it make to family and friends? That's an interesting opportunity for a church to really make a difference for someone. I remember hearing about a woman who, and she shared some of this with me. This is a woman I knew who had lost her only child when that child was a young adult. And this person did not have an active faith experience, was not part of a church community. But during the time of this person's, of their child's death, they prayed hard, and they asked God some direct questions, and they felt that they had been communicated with in a supernatural way. And so what to do with that? They lost their child. They've experienced something they don't understand. And how to somehow incorporate that into their life, into their understanding. And they found that help in the church that did that funeral. The next question is something that I think is quite relevant to us right now. Consider cases where deep grief is compounded by severe financial concerns. Having to borrow to pay for the funeral, or facing deep anxiety about the loss of a wage earner. Given the Bible's admonishments about widows and orphans, how do we discern our responsibility in these situations? And how would the church know of these needs? Just in the last 24 hours, I've talked with 2 people who are both facing uncertainty about their jobs and difficult medical tests that might give them diagnoses that are very challenging. So there are a lot of folks right now who are going to be facing both big concerns about their jobs and dealing with losses. And we're going to have to think about how we can place ourselves in those situations, because that's what churches do. The last question that I have here, again, is relevant. Think about a personal loss being magnified because it takes place during a major disaster, such as flooding or an earthquake, that causes many deaths along with destruction and suffering. How can people be the hands and feet of Christ in these situations? Wow, that's what we may be facing. We don't know yet what the magnitude of all this is going to be, but we are the church and we have to be prepared to deal with it. I'd love to hear feedback from any of you on how well this has worked, and particularly everyone in the church wants to hear ideas that you may have or thoughts you may have about how we can do better in this time. So please feel free to do that either via the comments or by calling the church or using the Facebook page. Let's wrap up with the closing prayer from this study. And this comes from the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend to the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary, bless the dying, soothe the suffering, pity the afflicted, shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake. Amen.